and welcome to Media 7 in front of a live audience at Auckland's Classic Comedy Club. In this week's show, we'll plunge into the world of tabloid publishing, where real human drama is but a chance to turn the dollar. But we'll start much closer to home. This is the week of the government's Employment Summit, where stakeholders talk about how to hold on to jobs in an economic crisis. The trade unions will be at the table, but their voice in the media is not what it was. Just the way of the world? Or should we hear more of organisations that still represent hundreds of thousands of New Zealanders? Things were different 58 years ago this week, when War on the Wharves broke out. In this week's Take 2, Sarah Daniell is on the waterfront.
The waterfront lockout, February 1951. It was the largest, longest and nastiest industrial dispute in New Zealand's history.
It was supposed to be the right of every worker in New Zealand to work a 40-hour week. The long hours of overtime we were working at the time were being constantly used by the shipping companies to keep down our hourly rate. We were told that you work all hours required by the employer, or you don't work at all, on all waterfronts in New Zealand. We found them guarded by police. We were not allowed to go onto the waterfronts. Ours wasn't a strike, ours was a lockout.
It would last 151 days and involve 22,000 wharfies, their families and supporters. We're at war, said Prime Minister Sid Holland.
Unless work is resumed on the wharf, then a proclamation of emergency will be declared.
Bring in the troops. A state of emergency was declared, censorship imposed, police were given free range to flex their muscle.
They turned New Zealand into a police state. Any policeman had the power to arrest without warrant. It was an offence to give a loaf of bread to the wife or children of a waterside worker.
What did the public make of all this?
To most of the public who were, I think, generally prejudiced against the watersiders, simply did not know what case the watersiders had.
They never heard both sides of the story because the unions were banned from radio and press.
The only means that we could get our side across to the people was by producing pamphlets. Needless to say, they were all illegal.
They were staunch to the end, but there was no happy ending for the workers. Nor was it a glorious moment for the media. So what can be gained from looking back at such a bitter chapter in our history?
The outcomes are often delivered by a whole range of other things, not just one single event. It certainly showed me that somehow all of the answers about today's problems are in our past.
Joining us to ruminate on the past, present and future of the organised labour message are the man who closed that report, Ken Douglas, who, although no longer CTU president, remains the face we associate with the trade union movement. Former Alliance Party leader and National Secretary of the National Distribution Union, Lila Harry, and Graham Hunt, author of Black Prince, the biography of 20th century union giant Fintan Patrick Walsh. Welcome to you all. Ken, I'm going to start by picking you up on the question that concluded that clip. What lessons for the present can we learn from what happened in 1951?
I think essentially the fate of the watersiders was sealed in 1949, actually, when the Carpenters Union was deregistered by in the last days of the Labour government, and a significant schism was created in the Federation of Labour. A lot of unions, including the union I came from, the Drivers' Union, walked out of the FOL at that time. And so the seeds were were sown to split the union movement effectively. The watersiders' action were completely justified in the context of overtime being voluntary, but it was imposed as a condition of the employers on the waterfront, and their resistance to that was met with the full forces of the state. And
yet that was a message they were unable to get across because there was a media blackout. That couldn't happen today, could it?
I'm not sure that it couldn't, actually. I don't think that our media really play a role in giving people information. I think they like to present sensation more than information. The critical challenges for the union movement in the present circumstance is to be able to have a platform to articulate what is needed to create decent work and sustainable jobs, and that's not reported.
I wonder if part of the issue is in the media sense is that you are still, for most New Zealanders, the face of the union movement. Does that suggest that those people aren't being made anymore?
Well, that's a sad indictment on me, I guess, but I'm sorry if that's the case, because...
Bit of a worry for the union movement too, Ted.
I think the union movement's always going to be about the youth in the future. The struggles of the union movement are really about not self-interest now, but investing in somebody else's benefit.
If you go to your Wikipedia article, Ken, you're described as the most recognisable current trade unionist. Which, you're right, it does say something. I mean, Graham, you wrote about Walsh, who was a giant figure who everyone knew. I mean, what's happened to those people? How have they gone missing?
Well, we've lost the characters out of politics, not just out of politics, but out of life. We've become a bit sanitised, but also the nature of business of unskilled people working on wharves or in railways or in timber works or freezing works have gone. How many of us really know a freezing worker now, or even for that matter a watersider? Yet I grew up in a working class neighbourhood where half the people who went to school with their fathers worked in the freezing work, so that's changed. We've deindustrialised, and I think what 51 was the last gasp of old New Zealand. That was the beginning of the end of those big unions and unskilled people. We've got a much better educated workforce now. We have poor people, of course, who are abused and treated badly, but for the most part, people are far more selective as to what organisations they join, not just unions, but employers' organisations as well.
But so they're not seeing those, the people at the head of unions as leadership figures in the media. I mean, Lila, does that mean that it's incumbent on you to do some personal marketing, to be a bit Matt McCartan and be everywhere? I mean, he would be the one, I would guess, who was the most recognisable.
Well, I think the recognition for union leaders of Ken's era was really a product of our industrial relations regulatory environment. You had, at the peak of the union movement, the leadership of all our industrial bargaining. So the award rounds led by the Metals Award or a key award, then translated through to wage increases for all New Zealanders.
And those people as personalities were directly associated with them.
Well, there was an institution. There was a mechanism, i.e. award bargaining, which highlighted the issues on an annual basis. It was easy to follow industrial relations stories in the media 30 years ago before the Employment Contracts Act, because you really only had one story to follow.
I mean, Matt McCartan's got a hunger strike on this week, and amongst the market research workers, and I can't see that story's been picked up anywhere. But
it's not picked up because
I was unaware of it.
Because it's just so out of sync with popular thinking. Why would you, in the middle of a recession, a worldwide recession, where research workers don't have any work, they've got nothing to research, why would you go on a hunger strike? I mean, that is just stupidity of the worst order. And it's all very well getting publicity, but that's not what we're about. We're talking about saving jobs. So this job summit coming up supposedly is to keep the economy going, keep people in work. That will not keep people in work. And those tactics might have worked, 50 odd years ago, but they don't work now. I mean, we've got I think the Generation Y, we were talking about that before, young people who don't join anything. They don't join St John Ambulance, they don't work as volunteers, they don't join charities, they certainly don't join unions in number, and they don't join employers' organisations. They're far more interested in sitting in front of their screen and looking beautiful.
That might be an outcome, but I think Lila's right. The other element about Lila's answer was that the general wage order system moved every wage, every charge in the community, government charges, private sector charges, and so the focus of the media on the personalities that were involved in that process was a natural response of the media selling news and giving information.
It was extremely relevant to every working person in
every
the country.
Person in the country was influenced by the outcome of those. Well, that's not the case now.
Let's do an experiment now then, shall we? We'll do something we don't usually do, an extremely scientific poll of the audience here. Could I have a show of hands from you people out there? Who knows who Helen Kelly is? Hand up, please. 2 from an 3 from an audience of about 40. She does Ken's old job as president of the Council of Trade Unions. I mean, that's kind of telling, isn't it? She hasn't been in the job that long, but I would guess that people know who Matt McCartan is. I wonder whether everyone has to be like Matt McCartan now to get stuff done.
I mean, Helen Kelly has not had a high profile in the union movement prior to becoming president of the CTU, but I would expect her to acquire a profile pretty rapidly. She hasn't been in the job for long. And, you know, I mean, there are opportunities with engagement, for instance, through the Jobs Summit and so on, to build a profile around that. She's come from pretty low profile unions in terms of a public appearance in the past. But you have, you know, people like Andrew Little, head of the EPMU, who's pretty consistently in the media. That union is often presenting a case in relation to issues, as are a number of others. Brenda Pilot, head of the Public Service Association, constantly putting out her union's messages into the media. So, I mean, I think the work is being done in unions, and I think that it's a slightly more appealing image for a lot of people that they see from union leaders now than perhaps, with all due respect, to the Douglas or Knox or previous eras.
Well, that's actually an interesting point, Ken, because union leaders are less visible now than they were in your heyday, but they're also less reviled. I mean, you were a polarising figure, weren't you?
Yes, I suppose so. But I think the critical issue is, to bring it back to the role of the media, is that I, with due respect, don't think that the media is interested in giving quality information. Like Helen Kelly will make one of the most important contributions, positive contributions to the summit on Friday. And I'd like to wager now she'll get about that much in the media, because the media will be looking for the sensationalism. The media is already be fixed with who's not there. God, I'm bloody pleased I didn't get invited. I've been too many of the damn things.
Graham, what's your response?
Well, I'd agree with that.
On behalf of all journalists.
Yeah, when I started in journalism, because every newspaper had an industrial reporter or two, and that's what kept them going. And when I was in England, even more so, a newspaper I was on, we had, I think, 2 or 3 at any one time, and that dominated the news. I think 2 or 3 lead stories out of 6 or 7 were mostly industrial stories. But the moment the government moves out of business, you move away from centralised wage fixing, then in the end people form their own views about industry. Also, they have access to a lot of other information. They don't need to listen to a 5-hour speech from Finn and Patrick Walsh, because he used to get up there at the annual Federation Labour Conference to talk for 5 hours. The only person who talked longer was Khrushchev. He had the General Secretary in Russia of the Communist Party, and he would talk for 7 hours. Now, can you imagine anybody speaking for 5 hours and union members putting up with it? But his speeches, and I read them, most of them, are peppered with economic information. He was privy to government information. He was an economic advisor of sorts to the government. He was on various government bodies. And they listened to every skerricket of information about hints about the exchange rate, hints about where the economy is going, price control, those things. You don't need that now, because you can get it through your computer, you can look, you can go on the internet, and you know before anyone else knows. So you don't need a union leader to front in that sort of sense.
Well, that's actually an interesting point about the economic advice, is that it strikes me that the CTU employees who do get press and do get invited to comment are the economists, Peter Harris and then Peter Conway. And Peter Harris, I think, has actually has proved himself to be more right than wrong in the last few years. He was the one that was right about telecom.
But I think that's partly a product of what rounds are covered. I mean, there are economics or business reporters, and they will go to economists even if they are employed by unions to comment. They need stories, they need information, and that allows those figures to comment quite regularly. Graham sort of pointed out the lack of specialist industrial relations reporters. I mean, it's a generalisation of news rounds, which has been very much at the expense of ongoing industrial relations coverage in the media. I talk to a lot of journalists, about ad hoc disputes, and often having to do a basic tutorial in the industrial relations system before we can even begin to explain what the issue is that is at dispute between the parties.
Whereas in the past you might have had the guy with the trade union round who'd been doing it for 10 years.
That's right, who actually knew how the system worked and mightn't even know the relationship historically between those particular parties. But when we're enterprise bargaining, our union alone does 410 collective agreements, you know, on a rotational basis. It's a far cry from the 10 awards that our union would have been involved in negotiating 20 or 30 years ago. There's a lot more knowledge to be had, and you know, I think it would be very hard for the media to really have the depth of specialisation that would be needed to track it.
How much of an issue is it that that so many more of us now are not earning wages? A lot of us are our own bosses, so that the worker-boss dichotomy doesn't really work there, does it?
I think that's true. So many people, even in industrial jobs, are contracted, or, you know, someone in the courier business, for instance, who would in the past be an employee of a carrying company, they're running their own business, so they don't have that sort of association. Among journalists, and I'm one of them, are freelancers now. We work on our own and we have our own networks, but we don't meet journalists on a day-to-day basis. We talk to them by email, we talk to them by phone, but we don't see them, and that's the nature of where we are. The other issue is that for industrial reporters, they're always men. I mean, there was a gender issue. When I was at the Auckland Star, I don't think ever had a woman industrial relations reporter when I was there. And the only one I could think of nationally was Di Billing at Radio New Zealand, and she made new ground, but, you know, union officials were mostly male and they didn't want to talk to women.
Right. Well, we'll actually pick up the newsroom culture. We're going to take a break now, but I think it's worth talking about because it is very different now. We'll be back soon.